This session will be a short presentation of the content of the readings that will be used for the fifth Sunday of Easter. The first reading comes from Acts of the Apostles 9, and it speaks about how Saul, St. Paul, went to Jerusalem. And when he first arrived, the other disciples didn't want to accept him because they knew of his reputation, that he had persecuted the church. And so it's Barnabas who introduced Saul to the community. They finally accepted him. He began to preach, but he was persecuted by the Hellenists, those who spoke Greek, much as Stephen had been. Therefore, he was snuck out of the city, and he had to go to Tarsus for a couple years until Barnabas would once again call him to preach together with him in Antioch. In spite of this, we hear that the church grew in wisdom and numbers, that the Holy Spirit is guiding the church, and even when one or another of the disciples was being persecuted, it didn't mean that the gospel was being imprisoned. Rather, the Holy Spirit worked in mysterious ways to touch people's hearts so that they would turn to the Lord. The second reading is from the first letter of John, chapter 3, and there's three main ideas contained in this reading. The first is something that we find in the letter of James, that our Christianity should not just be talk, just be ideas, but should be lived in our everyday life. We should give testimony to our faith by our actions. The second idea is that we shouldn't even condemn ourselves because we don't really know how culpable we are before God. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do an examen of conscience, do the best that we can, but we should also realize that we don't know the depths of our weaknesses that we inherited. We don't know the depths of our strengths. And so we do the best we can, and then we trust in the mercy of God. And then finally, if we're going to follow Jesus, then we will keep the commandments. The commandments are not seen as rules imposed upon us from the outside, but rather as guidelines to help us realize what love really means in our everyday life. Finally, for the gospel, we have John 15, 1-8, which is the parable of the vine and the branches. Jesus is the vine. He is the one who supplies us with nourishment, who gives us growth. We can't hope to produce fruit outside of Jesus. We might even do good actions, but if they're not based upon love and service, then, as St. Paul says, it's like a gong that's just sounding. It has no real musical value. We have to base our actions, our love, upon the love that we first received from Christ. If we don't do that, Jesus says that we'll be cut off like branches that aren't bearing fruit and will be thrown into the fire. This is a very dualistic gospel. Either we belong to Jesus or we belong to the prince of this world, Satan. And therefore, if you're not doing the work of Jesus, you must be doing the work of Satan. In everyday life, we realize it's not just black and white. There's a lot of grays, there's a lot of in between. But in the Gospel of John, you don't see much of that because this was a community that believed the end times was at hand. And therefore, you had no more time to waffle. You had to make a choice. And let's face it, even in our everyday life, while we are filled with weakness, while we are filled with doubts, sometimes we don't know what we should be doing. There is that fundamental choice. Am I going to try to follow Jesus with my whole heart? Or am I going to try to play a game in which I give my heart to Jesus sometimes and to the other one other times? This parable of the vine and the vineyard calls us to fidelity. And finally, this parable is also at times called a Eucharistic Parable. The Gospel of John is very rich for its Eucharistic symbolism. How much more Eucharistic could we be than the idea that we're nourished by God, that we're united with Jesus? And outside of Jesus, we can't bear fruit.